Hello and welcome back to the Out of Program podcast. Today we welcome Dr. Cosima Gretton, a medical doctor and chief product officer at Our Future Health, the world's largest health research program. She previously worked in digital health and diagnostics in the UK and US and served as deputy director for a novel COVID-19 testing technology at NHS Test Trace during the pandemic. Hi, Cosima. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Jane. Lovely to be here.
Brilliant. Let's dive straight in. So we start with your early career. You studied experimental psychology before moving into medicine. So could you start by talking to us about the motivations around that and why you decided to transition?
Yeah. So I've always been interested in intersection between the arts and sciences. And so part of the reason why I studied psychology was that it was the intersection between, well, the course itself was an intersection between neuroscience and philosophy. And so it enabled me to study both the biology of the brain, but also the philosophy of mind. And that was a really fantastic combination. And so I moved into medicine in order to actually go down a route of neuropsychiatry. And that was the original plan, which has obviously since changed. And it was actually my background in psychology that probably also kind of led me to leaving medicine, because one of the big things that I studied was human factors design. My professor was called Charles Spence, and he did lots of really fascinating work to do with cross-modal integration. So basically how different senses integrate information. And that was used for various industrial applications, some of which were kind of marketing, like how to make, a product feel smoother by changing the shape of the bottle. But others were used for how to improve driving safety. Using alerts and cross-modal notifications, so haptics and things, and also aviation. And so I was really familiar with the idea that humans are fallible, that we rely on information from our senses that needs to be curated and designed in a way that will make it usable and help us make the right decisions in the moment. And then I went into medicine, and the technologies, the systems, the processes are all designed with the assumption that you have a professional who is immune to these factors. But fundamentally, doctors are humans. And so I was just kind of horrified at how easy it was to make mistakes using the software, how I witnessed other people make mistakes, how systems, processes, products were designed that basically caused error and harm. And so that was really what led me to actually leave medicine in the end as well. So you can see there's kind of psychology and the brain took me in and then ended up taking me out again, because I actually realized I wanted to figure out how to improve the system at large.
Brilliant. And you mentioned the intersection of art and medicine. Now, whilst you were a medical student, I believe, you co-founded something called the AXNS Collective. So can you share a bit more about that? What sparked that idea and how did you go about it?
Yeah, the idea was sparked, actually, my mother's an artist, and one of the things that she teaches a course, and she'd spent quite a lot of time working with a couple of students who have Down syndrome. And one of the interesting things that kind of talking to them came through was kind of understanding how their experience of the world affected the way they painted and drew. And they painted the most, one of the students became a really famous artist, and she painted absolutely incredibly beautiful pieces. And from her perspective, her experience of Down syndrome actually influenced her art. And so I was really interested in how, as the brain is, the way we see and perceive the world and influences how we behave in the world, how does the brain influence how we, and changes in the brain influence how we create? And so it started out as it was combining neuroscience and art. And so it started out as the first exhibition was bringing together 12 different artists who each had a personal experience of a different neurological condition. So this is not about psychiatry. It's not about mental illness. It was much more about neurology. And worked with them and with different academics in the field, in different fields, to basically curate an exhibition that talked about how they felt their experiences were a part of their art or not, and also then worked with the academics to kind of understand what might that tell us about the brain and what might that tell us about science. And interestingly, quite a lot of the artists that we worked with were already working with some of those leaders in the field. So there was a guy called John Adams, who had, I think he described he had Asperger's, and he was working with Simon Baron-Cohen. So there were kind of lots of different intersections already happening, and we were bringing them all together. And so it started out with that initial project, and then evolved into a series of other projects that were about exploring the mind and the brain with through art. So we had another one that was using virtual reality, augmented reality, to explore some very complex visual phenomena. And then we also had a subsequent project, which was a collaboration with Imperial, where we did Imperial College London were doing some research into how the mind processes music on LSD. And so we had a really exciting project where we brought together music producers and data scientists, and we were allowed to use the data from this research project to produce an album of music using the EEG data from the participants who'd been on LSD listening to music. So complex, convoluted, but actually very exciting and really interesting in terms of what was produced at the end of the day, and lots of fascinating discussions about the mind and, you know, transposing of information through different media. Yeah.
So it's interesting talking about your early experiences because, you know, you're very much presenting it through the lens of an academic or an intellectual. But I'm curious to know if you saw yourself as an entrepreneur at that point, and if you gave any consideration towards making it into an enterprise, scaling it, and making it a lasting organization.
Yeah, it was a great question. So the challenge with it was that part of the mandate and the kind of, you know, the four people who ran it, myself included, part of the kind of reason why we were able to set it up and run it was that we each came from these kind of core disciplines. And I think, you know, in your early 20s, you're defined by the role that you're currently doing, right? And so one of the things we realized was that if we, you know, I came from medicine, we had someone who was from the Courtauld. I can't remember the other the other backgrounds, but essentially an intersection of the arts and sciences. And one of the challenges in our early 20s was that if any one of us had left those areas to just focus exclusively on this, it would then start to become a completely different career that we weren't quite sure we wanted, and wouldn't quite we'd lose some of that like magic of bringing together those different areas. We also, I mean, it was a community interest company, so it was not for profit. And so it was mainly funded by grants, Wellcome Trust and the Arts Council. And we did explore lots of models for thinking about how we might scale it. But actually, one of the reasons why it was magical was in doing these projects that didn't necessarily have commercial incentives. So for me, it was never going to be a scaled business. It wasn't a commercial operation. Yeah.
And then you talked a little bit about going into medicine, but then ultimately transitioning out. I'd be keen to hear more about your career as an NHS doctor, you know, transitioning from student into a practicing medic. How did you find that? And was there any kind of epiphanies from that experience?
Yeah. It was definitely a lot better being a doctor to being a student. I would say that the system is not set up to be a graduate medic. If once you really, the system is designed for people to go in 18. And I think the advice I'd give to my younger self is if you really wanted to do it, start at 18 and go all the way through and get out the other side as quickly as you can. I think there's various challenges that many people listening to this will be familiar with. So I won't go into those, but I think that you know, I didn't, being a student was really, really challenging. Not because it was academically challenging, more because it was intellectually challenging and also kind of autonomy challenging, I think. having come from a kind of background of research, where, Oxford, it was really about thinking from first principles, very exploratory and creative and truly scientific, to then go into medicine that was incredibly protocolized for good reason, and where you really just need to learn stuff and just stay in the lane. It was really hard. And that was partly why AXNS was created, because I just needed a creative outlet, an independent creative outlet where I could just offer my own thing. And however, once I started working as a doctor, it is very different once you're actually on the front line and using the knowledge that you've gained. And it's incredibly, it's a fantastic skill to have. It's an amazing experience to be able to apply what you know in difficult situations to make things better. I think that was kind of really what drew me towards it, was a need to, it's so directly related to like fixing something and in sometimes a really direct and obvious like way, and then sometimes an incredibly frustrating and convoluted way, because you're calling a million different people in different wards and you can't get through, and like it's really painful. So yeah, it's definitely was better being a doctor, but by that point I'd kind of already mentally left, so it was too late really. I had decided that I was more interested in the broader system, and the technology.
So then you made a significant pivot from clinical practice into health tech. Can you tell me what the trigger point for that was, and I guess what made you move into your first role, which was at Karius?
Yeah, so I think it did start with AXNS, because AXNS was really the first kind of pathway into, I can create stuff, I can just build stuff, and realizing that I really enjoyed that creative process, even if it's creative in an entrepreneurial way. It's creative in a building a new thing, and the problem solving on the fly that comes with that. So that really led me to say, well, I think I'm not happy in medicine. I'm going to take a year out. And I took a year out in the middle of med school, and I decided to just give myself a year to just explore and go and do various bits and pieces. And I ended up working for a couple of different startups at a accelerator called Wayra. That was really transformational. I ended up kind of basically doing product work, because I was at Skin Analytics, which you're probably familiar with. This was back in 2013, and I was working with Neil, the founder. It was basically Neil and I think Tom at the time, and so it was commercial software. And then I was kind of just doing like a lot of product work really with Tom, but it wasn't really called that at the time, or I didn't know it to be that. And what really changed my experience and career trajectory was a kind of sliding doors moment where that winter, and bear in mind, this is the 1 year academic year, August to August, where I have nothing, or September to September, where I don't have anything scheduled. And so it's a very precious moment in time. And I went for a drink with a friend of mine who was visiting from the US, and we nearly didn't go for a drink because I had the flu. And she said, no, I'll come and see you. And she traveled for 2 hours across London to come and see me. And we sat down, and I told her about what I was doing at Wayra and health tech. And she said, oh, you should apply for this program my husband went to called Singularity University. It's every summer for 3 months. And the deadline's in 5 days. And it was the only summer I could have done that, because every summer I would have been, being a medic or, working. And I pulled together an application, and I actually it cost an awful lot of money at the time. I didn't have, a lot of money. And so I pulled together an application and basically said that, yes, I'd figure out a way to pay for it. And I managed to fundraise the money to pay for it. And that was just, it was really transformational, because it took me out to Silicon Valley, and I met people from all across the globe who are still friends to this day, who built amazing companies from that program. And we had 6 weeks of learning about exponential technologies, and then 6 weeks of building a startup. And this was back in 2014, when it wasn't really, people weren't talking about AI, or at least as far as I wasn't, no one I knew was, AI, driverless cars, Bitcoin, all of those things. I didn't buy any Bitcoin, my biggest regret.
You and me both.
And where I had a wallet and was like, I could do it for you. And I was like, that's fine. Anyway, I was like, this is a silly idea. So, but that really catapulted, because when I came back, because I'd been in that environment at NASA Ames, hearing from like all of these incredible people, when I came back to the UK, I then was able to get roles and jobs that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I wrote a paper for the King's Fund on emerging technologies, and then I got my first product role, really, which was for outcomes-based healthcare, which is a fantastic company that essentially I was working on an Innovate grant to see if we could use smartphone data to predict outcomes in people with diabetes and build it up, basically. And that was what then I was able to talk to when I then, got the interview at Karius.
And then how did you find your time at Carius?
Yeah, Karius was an amazing place, and actually I have learned so much about it that's relevant to this day. And so my role was product manager, and my boss, Jason, he now works at Tempus, which does lots of AI cancer stuff. And it was a big transition, and I think Jason was really good at mentoring me through it. I think the big challenge for anyone leaving medicine and going into product, or medicine and just going to industry, or academia and going to industry, is transitioning between being an expert to in fact, particularly with product, to not being an expert. And in fact, the two disciplines are kind of polar opposites. In medicine, you do lots of training and education, so that in the moment you are the expert, and what you say is what happens to a certain extent. Whereas product is actually very different. Product is intentionally a naive practice. It is about thinking from first principles, testing your, being really clear that you have assumptions, that you need to test them, and you need evidence for them, and the user is the source of the truth, not you. And I think the challenge with being clinical in product is that you think that your own expertise is the truth, but actually medicine's super wide and varied, and even if you're building a product for doctors, they're completely different doctors doing different things. And so having to shake off that expertise, and also learning how to matrix manage. So again, the same thing where like I didn't line manage any of the team that I had to lead, but I needed to be the person who would set the vision, set the direction, inspire everyone to move towards it, but enable them to figure out how to get there, and enabling them to figure out how to get there, but being really clear on where we're trying to get. I think there's really fundamental learning that's helped me as a leader subsequently as well.
It's a super interesting point, actually, because if we reflect back to the start of your journey, you were very much an academic, and in moving from that kind of academic clinical expertise, that mindset, into product, where, as you describe it, you need to approach things from first principle and be comfortable with not being that expert, but also that transition from, I guess, clinician and academic to operator. I guess Karius, it sounded like that was your watershed moment.
Yeah, it was definitely a big transformational moment, and because also it was led, both Carius and Mindstrong it was a great experience of learning from people who knew product in the Bay Area. There's some amazing people, amazing skills out there. So whereas with outcomes-based healthcare, it was primarily like a data company, it wasn't really a product company. They were fantastic, but not that particular kind of skill set. I didn't have mentorship around, whereas at Karius and Mindstrong, there was that. And I think Karius also taught me what it takes to go from research into clinical, because I joined at a time when they had a research use only pipeline. They had a research product. They were using their test in studies, but they were not selling it as a commercial product. And it was, the depth of expertise in how to build a scalable commercial clinical grade pipeline at that company was great back then, and is obviously, I've spoken to some of them recently, is just amazing now. But it did also teach me about the benefit of clinical knowledge in product. So we were looking at like product market fit and where would we use this test. And just for background, the test is or at least was at the time. It's like a single blood draw that can detect, at the time it was 1,000 pathogens using cell-free DNA. And it was expensive, and because it was a single lab in the US, took 72 hours turnaround time. And that was, that understanding of, okay, well, we have this test, it's for infectious disease, but how is this actually going to be used in clinical practice? And that's this kind of clinical product market fit problem that's quite specific, because the reality was, right, we started out in sepsis, but the reality was that no one's going to wait to pay $2,000 and wait 72 hours for a first line test in sepsis. You're just not going to. You're going to take, take blood and give broad spectrum antibiotics and then go from there. But also you have infectious disease doctors whose entire career and profession is figuring out what's the next test to do and the differential around the symptoms and the potential pathogen. And this was a test that basically said, don't worry about any of that. We'll just tell you what it is, because we're going to just detect them all. And so that product market fit and that changing of clinical practice was really challenging. And so it ended up being the clinical product market fit is now leukemia and immunocompromised patients, because that's perfect, right? You don't have a lot of time. It's going to be something weird. The stakes are high. The person's on expensive chemo drugs. So you're going to spend a lot of money on a test to just quickly figure out what the hell it is. You don't have time to go through that diagnostic odyssey. But it took a while to get to that. And I think that's where, as a clinician working in industry, having that understanding of the whole way that the system works and operates, to compare it to the sister spin-out company. So the same professor, Steve Quake, spun out two companies, one called Ariosa Diagnostics and one called Karius. Karius was later. And Ariosa was incredibly successful. And Ariosa was basically the non-invasive prenatal testing. So essentially a blood draw for fetal cell-free DNA to test for Downs, etc., rather than amniocentesis, or rather amniocentesis is the next stage. And so what it was displacing was an expensive, invasive, high-risk test. So it was very clear that that's exactly where it went in the clinical pathway, and that's exactly what it displaced. But even then, with that, that had political implications, because the people who did the amniocentesis had challenges with it. So I think it taught me there's a lot of benefit from being a clinician, of understanding that you're going into, but equally also changing how you work internally with the team is probably the other fundamental learning.
It's so interesting hearing your perspective of clinical product management and the idea of product market fit in the clinical diagnostics setting. And I'm sure we can explore that to great length. But you mentioned the company Mindstrong a few times. And I wanted to explore that a bit further, because that company was based in the US. So not only did you make a career pivot, you also then, to some extent, made a life pivot. I'd be curious to know from you, in terms of making that transition to the US and working in the US rather than the UK. How did you view that? And did you see any kind of long-term implications for your life?
It was pulling the ripcord on my returning to medical practice. Because, and I knew that at the time, for two reasons. I left during F2. It was the right thing to do. That was when I had the job offer. You didn't have much choice. In retrospect, I think if you could time it better, you would leave after F2. Very hard to go back to medicine if you leave in the middle of your family. And the second is that if you go to America after you leave, it's very hard to keep up any kind of practice or validation, right? And so by the time I came back, I was quite far out of it. So big implications for whether or not I could go back to medicine. Very kind of strange place to be, having left medicine, because in the UK, when you said I've left medicine, a lot of people at the time went, oh wow, that's okay, interesting, how did you do that? I'd love to know. We weren't really leaving medicine to go into tech at the time. And whereas when I went to America, everyone went, why the hell would you leave medicine? Because it's valued very differently there. They are valued and paid, but completely differently. And so the attitude towards it was very different. Other implications, I don't think there were any other, the rest of it was just great. I'm very glad I went. It was very different place, different way of thinking, different way of working. I really like the American way of working. Very direct, very fast, very operational. Yeah. And then I went back to Test and Trace, which actually in the pandemic, Test and Trace was quite similar. And then it became more British, let's just say.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that, because of course the pandemic was a pivotal time for many. What was, I guess I'm curious to know what made you then leave the US to come back
Mm.
and take this role? Although I suspect, given what you said, probably know the answer to that. But I'd love to hear it. And then I'd love to hear a bit more about what that role looked like.
So part of the reason why I came back, two reasons. One, I'd reached the limit of what I was getting out of being there. A lot of the challenge with being there when you kind of come from the NHS is the commercial and private healthcare and the kind of distorting effect that has on the value you create. And so I'd been thinking about moving back, but I just was struggling to kind of like make myself do it because it's a big move and I loved being in California. But then the pandemic happened and my father had Parkinson's and wasn't very well. And so I decided I want to be closer to him. So I moved back with the agreement to work temporarily for a couple of months. But of course, because of the travel ban, couldn't get back again. And I think a lot of people around the world this happened to. There was like a musical chairs thing, which people were just rapidly trying to move country, while they could. And then while I was in London, actually kind of really started enjoying it, and London opened up, and it actually was a really amazing summer in a weird way. And so I decided to stay, and I started looking for jobs because I couldn't do the Mind Strong job remotely forever. I was working till midnight because it was terrible West Coast hours. Started looking for jobs, and that was when I got, life brings you sometimes very confusing situations, and I got offered a exec director role at Blue Shield of California, which was basically reimagining their mental health infrastructure and strategy for the state of California. And it was a huge job, like really, really significant role. And and then the jobs I had at offer in the UK, weren't nearly as exciting. And so I had this really difficult decision about whether I should go back, because they'd also were saying they could get me an exemption to the travel ban to travel back, because of it being health related. Anyway, I made the difficult decision to turn it down and to stay in London because it was one of those things where I just didn't want to be far away from family anymore. I was kind of done with it. And so luckily, sometimes you've got to say no to things to let other things come along. And so just a couple of weeks later, kind of my good friends, who've a good friend now and kind of career mentor, Emma Stanton, was recruiting for Test and Trace, kind of very quickly onboarded because they were just go, as you can imagine. And I joined as a deputy director to basically lead she had been asked to essentially set up 5 work streams, 5 programs to find, source, validate and procure and then deploy alternative technologies to PCR, because basically there was just no PCR test capacity in the planet. And so we needed to find alternative tests. And there's also a paper that came out that said sensitivity is secondary to turnaround time. And that actually you don't actually need for this particular disease, because of the very long asymptomatic run up to then where you're actually infectious. Sensitivity is not as important. What's important is actually getting the result really rapidly so that you can then quarantine yourself. And that was quite a radical paper from a public health diagnostics perspective, because everything is about sensitivity. And so essentially then Emma lined up 5 technologies that were alternatives to that, one of which was lateral flow. I led one called LAMP. We had basically, our task was get to 10 million tests a day by Christmas. And that was September. And it was a incredibly exciting, fast-paced time where Test and Trace was filled with people from industry, people from pharma, diagnostics, tech, operations. We worked the military with some, obviously the consulting companies were working there, some really fantastic people from those organizations. And we got so much done in such a short period of time. It was astounding. But, the whole program itself was populated by people on secondment and so people would roll off and roll on all the time. And so by the time the vaccine had taken effect, it was clear that like a lot of the testing capacity we had, we wouldn't need anymore. So we started to shut down the programs that I was running, and then decided that I had two options really, like carry on as a civil servant, or go do something else. And I'm not, as much as it was amazing, and I've seen the power of government when it really gets going. I mean, it's incredible. I didn't want to be a civil servant. And so, yeah, I stepped out.
And that brings us on to your most recent experience, which is in Our Future Health. And you started off as a director of digital health before more recently becoming the chief product officer. So can you tell me more about that journey and what that looked like for you in terms of your career?
So when I joined the organization, the challenge they had was we needed to been really successful in two core things, which is recruiting our volunteers to take part and then making the data available to researchers. And so if you think about it, when a volunteer signs up, they provide blood pressure and height and weight, and then they provide blood samples, and then they consent to link health records. And that whole recruitment, has been enormous. We've recruited 3 million, nearly 2.5 million people across the UK. And if you think about then, there's this huge amount of data that we have to bring into the secure places and curate and make available for researchers to do their research. And so we'd done those two things really successfully. But another core part of our promise was to do two other things that involve going back to our participants. One is providing them with feedback from their test and from their measurements. So returning some of the information we hold to them. And the other is it was recontacting our participants to take part in research studies. So providing with connecting them to other research studies and that are relevant to them. And those two things are really hard to do because we've been just so focused on these two big pieces. And so I was brought in to basically try to set up this whole new kind of piece of work. It was also interesting. One of the reasons why I was brought in was that because it's a very research organization, there's lots of academics and clinicians. And then we also have this huge product and tech team, because in order to do anything at the scale nationally, you need, technology platform. And so there's this blend of these two worlds that is people coming in from tech companies and people coming in from academia. And one of the reasons why I was brought in was because I understand that kind of intersection and have experienced the challenges and the opportunities that presents. And so so we stood up two different programs of work. So we contact and feedback, and essentially brought together lots of cross-functional teams. And this is an area where I think my experience of product management at the beginning of my career was just so helpful, because it's about matrix leading people that you don't line manage. My actual line management was very small, like 3 people. The people I actually needed to get, to help do what we needed to do were from different functions. And so it's all about that kind of bringing everyone together around that shared mission. The feedback's been more challenging. We are rolling out some feedback to our participants over this coming year, but one of the big challenges that we have is around making sure that it is compliant with the regulations. And so, as a research program, our primary priority is to collect the data for researchers to leverage to generate science and insights that are going to then translate back into health practices or health products. And returning the feedback requires compliance with a set of regulations that are actually different to what a research company normally operates under. And so a lot of what we've been doing in the last few years has been figuring out how do we chart a path at scale through that. And I'm very aware of it's a lot, having done it at Karius, right? And that was a small company. So and then but on the recontact side, we have established the service. We've actually just recently launched. It's called the Clinical Research Recruitment Service. And really excitingly, we did our first partnership and first project with a study that was looking at prevention of heartburn and prevention of heartburn, and we've had amazing response rates from our participants who've been invited. So obviously not everyone gets invited. It's only participants who have told us that they have heartburn, and then they can sign up and join this study. And yeah, that's been fantastic. People are obviously very keen and excited to take part in research, and it's just, we've got more studies coming up this year, and it's just really exciting to be able to build a platform where we can start to accelerate participation in research across the UK. That's going to have a huge impact. And the thing that I'm most excited about with recruitment to research is we are able to recruit people at risk of disease. And so what that means is that normally people get recruited to research once they have a disease and they're part of a patient registry, say. And that's fine, but that doesn't help you prevent the disease. It's very hard to recruit people to prevention studies because you need to have a huge sample size if you don't know the risk. And even if you do know the risk, you still need a huge sample size. So, because not everyone's developed it. So we're able to basically narrow down and provide and enable studies that have a population, a sample that has a risk of a disease, and then we can enable studies that look at the emergence of those symptoms and signs over time, and then test early interventions. So, yeah, that's been an amazing period of time.
Very cool. So you set up all these programs, and that started when you were the director of digital health, but then you've recently become the chief product officer. So how does that scope and responsibility change within the organization with this new role?
Yeah. It's a really interesting transition because I'm going from being very deep in a specific thing with a very specific outcome and a very specific problem set and a specific solution to actually being much more the kind of enabler of a system, of an organizational system. So my role is transforming from solving a specific problem for a user to actually designing an organization that can solve those problems better at scale. So for example, some of the things that I focus on are like, how do we make better decisions? How do we make decisions in a cohesive way that helps us move towards a coherent outcome when we've got lots of different teams working on different things all the time? How do we prioritize when we've got a lot of things we want to do, and how do we say no to stuff? And what information do we need to say no to stuff? And how do we structure our teams? And also, of course, how do we enable our teams to use the latest technologies to improve their work?
Very exciting. So we're running out of time. I want to end with one last question, which is that for clinicians listening who are curious about, transitioning, health technology, digital health, what practical advice would you give them based on your own experiences?
Decide, I think, the end state. I found like I didn't really have a plan, but I knew I did a lot of work to understand what I liked and how I liked to work. And I also had a rough idea that like I didn't think I was going to be a chief medical officer. I didn't think that was in my future and that it would be more likely to be chief product. And so I had a rough idea that like what was the thing that got me fired up. And the thing that really got me fired up was like some of the ways of thinking and the mindset of product. And also decide, I read something really early on that said your career, it was something around like your career shapes your mind and the way you think. And I think that's really true because I felt that the longer I stayed in medicine, I would really think in a certain way. And that actually there were other ways of thinking that were design, innovation, product thinking that I wanted to do, or wanted to be. So yeah, like decide that. And then also part of that is deciding when to leave medicine and how much of a foot to maintain in the door, because there's pros and cons. I did the model where you just leave super early and forge a completely new career. That has its challenges. This takes a long time to shake off the identity of being a doctor and say that you're something else, or whether you really want to. But also there's benefits to staying in, because you're really directly involved and you understand the problem space. And there's also benefits to going all the way through and coming out the other side and then doing the other things.
Fantastic. So that's all the time we have for today. For those listening, if you like what you hear and want to support the show, please do like and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast platform you're currently listening to us on. It would mean a lot to me, and it would help spread the message to others exploring alternative paths. Thanks for joining, and see you next time. Bye-bye.